Hey everybody, this is James Lindsay. You're listening to another exciting episode of New Discourses Bullets, where I give a short bullet point type summary of a single topic from woke Marxism that we all need to understand so that we can stop it. I want to talk to you today about DEI again, diversity, equity, and inclusion, or it could be unconscious bias or implicit bias or any of these sensitivity type trainings that you've seen at work. It could even be the kind of brainwashing sessions around sustainability training and so on. But less applicable than the DEI. Because what I want to introduce to you is a concept called speaking bitterness that actually came from Mao's China in the 1950s when he was conquering China kind of initially after having taken over the government. So reading about his reign in China in the 1950s, I was struck by this concept, this phrase that I had never heard of, which is speaking bitterness. And it was something that Mao used to effectively devastate the communities of China, to tear apart any possible communal resistance against the communists. And the way that they did this was by setting up these meetings that everybody had to go to on various threats and pains. And they would teach them to speak bitterness. In other words, to regurgitate their grievances, their wounds, which of course, if you're a fan and follower of my work, you're likely aware of the fact that we called all of these identity studies that you see in universities grievance studies at some point in the past. When we did the grievance studies affair, we were looking for a name that would describe, gender studies, queer studies, sexuality studies, media studies, the studies of science and technology, blah, blah, blah. All of these ideas. We wanted a catch-all term, and we came upon this idea of grievance studies, that they're studying grievances. Well, we could have called it bitterness studies, or maybe the use of bitterness here in the Chinese would translate over to grievances. But what would happen in general with these speak bitterness meetings in China is that the communists would, this is early 1950s. Okay, so if you don't know the history, Mao took over officially in October of 1949, and he had not yet tamed the entire country. He had merely driven the nationalist government out, and he had a country to tame and turn communist, and to begin with the projects of land reform and so on that he had promised the peasants, which in and of itself was a destructive program. But what would happen is that the communists would march into a new region, maybe a village, maybe a province, a county, something, and they would immediately set up what they called cadres, which were kind of communist leaders. They're bureaucrats, really. So they would immediately place cadres in each of these areas, and they would set up a required nightly, pretty much nightly, most places every night was required meeting, and everyone was required to attend these things. And like I said, there's various pains. If you refused, you might be shot, you might be, harangued as a troublemaker and have the village turned against you. They might do collective punishment to try to get people to force you to come, whatever. And the first part of the program was a data mining operation, actually. What the cadres did was have these people come to the meetings, and it was mostly tell your biography, spill your guts, tell us about your neighbors, tell us everything there was. There was no bitterness hidden in this yet. It was an information gathering operation. Tell us about the relationships. Tell us about who's, done who wrong and whatever. And the idea was to gather a ton of information to where they knew a ton about all of the villagers or, county members or peasants or whatever, so that they could use that information against them later. So they would gather this extensive biographical information on virtually everyone that they could through these kind of interrogation meetings. And sometimes it would be really detailed in information, including, the various misdeeds and cheats and intrigues that people were, oh, you were with my brother, blah, 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 different kind of stuff. They'd use this to start compiling biographical data on the for whatever purposes, on the excuse that they were learning the lay of the people so that they could classify people into one of several different class categories. Obviously, Mao separated the population into various class categories following communist theory. This isn't the famous red and black classes that you've heard about from the Cultural Revolution. This is actually, well, in a little bit before, but this is actually a prototype for that. And so the classes were things like rich peasant, middle peasant, lower peasant, laborer, or poor peasant instead of lower peasant maybe, and so on. And the idea was to put people in. Landlord was a class, and that was a problem. And they wanted people classified as such so that they could direct the Speak Bitterness campaigns later. So they gathered all this biographical data about people to figure out where they went in the hierarchy and to have tons of dirt on people to drag up. So over the course of several weeks after they'd come in and set this up, the communists would then begin what were called Speaking Bitterness campaigns. And these were used all over the country. She Van Fleet jumped in. I said something about this on Twitter recently. She Van Fleet jumped in and talked about how they were taught to speak bitterness about not just each other, but about old China. They were meant to complain about how China used to be under its either nationalist or imperialist or anything old, anything before Mao or the communists took over. They were supposed to speak bitterness about their country. Does that sound familiar? They were supposed to speak bitterness about their neighbors. They were supposed to speak bitterness about each other, speak bitterness even about themselves if they had something. And they were to air it all, especially about the nationalists, about the past of China, and about petty grievances in between individuals. And these nightly meetings where you had to go every night. This actually caused major problems because the farmers were peasants were being kept up till sometimes 1 or 2 in the morning to do these Speak Bitterness meetings after they had worked all day, maybe till sundown. And so everyone, as the Speak Bitterness part of the campaign started to take hold, everyone was encouraged to start airing grievances, very much like, on Festivus. And so the airing of grievances was meant to take place. There were to air grievances, like I said, against the old country, about the old leaders, about anybody that they could possibly connect to the nationalists, the Kuomintang. They were to air grievances about each other. And there was that class hierarchy that they had built out that was used to direct the grievances. And the idea, as it was explained, was just to get all of these divisions out in the open so that we can move past them. Does that sound familiar to diversity, equity, and inclusion? It should. It should feel extremely similar to any of these sensitivity trainings, whether it's social emotional learning in schools or whether it's a workplace training in DEI. The idea is, we have hidden racism, so let's get it out in the open and clarify. We have hidden homophobia and transphobia. Let's dredge it up, get it out in the open so we can move past it. That's the pretext for doing what amounts to speaking bitterness. Now pause for a second and realize it's called speaking bitterness. How is this going to be productive? How is this going to make anything better? And of course it doesn't. What it does is causes massive amounts of enmity between the people involved. And this is what we heard from DEI training all over the West. I heard it from British people. I heard it from American people. I heard it from Canadians. I heard it from Australians. I heard it from New Zealanders. All across the West, these DEI meetings would cause people to go and talk about the racism that they experience or the racism that they perpetrate, or it could be homophobia or transphobia or whatever, and air it all in public in the workplace, which turned the workplace toxic. Everything got all wicked. Everything got all complicated. Everybody was on eggshells around everybody else. You thought you had this great job, and then you find out your coworkers have secretly thought racist thoughts about you or transphobic thoughts or whatever the harmful thought, bad thought that they were perfectly well keeping to themselves. They may have exaggerated for credit when they were telling the story, and everything falls to crap. And that's exactly what happened in China, which is why I'm telling you this story. So at first, just like with a lot of the DEI training, most of the people that I've talked to who've been through these in workplaces found that most people are not very participatory, but you have a few people who are. They're excited about the opportunity to bitch and moan about their coworkers and about the company and about everything else and call it things with power like racist and sexist, power, magic words with magic powers to gain control over things. But most people are not. Most of the villagers in China also were very generally resistant to doing the Speak Bitterness programming. You might get them to condemn the nationalists who are out of power, or you might get them to condemn a corrupt leader, but it would be very difficult to get them to start condemning each other in the village. And to even accept these preposterous class divisions. Let me make a quick point about that. The class divisions were totally fake. They didn't actually apply. And as a matter of fact, I'm learning this reading a trilogy of the history of Mao's rule in China, which is called the People's Trilogy. It's 3 books: The Tragedy of Liberation, which is what I'm drawing from here, Mao's Great Famine, and then The Cultural Revolution by Frank Decatur. And I strongly recommend reading it. I've done a number now. I've started to do a book club where passages from these books for now, and then other books that I read, are things that are going to make it into my James Lindsay Only Subs product, which is a subscribers only platform. So if you want to hear where I'm getting this, go sign up for that. It's not expensive. And, you can hear from, or get the books yourself. I mean, whatever. I'm not trying to trick you into giving me money. But you can hear for yourself or read for yourself what I'm talking about. This is, documented history. And so, like I said, the villagers were resisting the speak bitterness, but I give a vignette in one of these, so-called Only Subs book clubs that I've put out, where I actually read how it tore apart this community, because once they were encouraged enough by the communists, and things started to get rolling, it starts to become competitive. Everybody, your neighbor airs grievances, so now you're pissed off at your neighbor, so you air grievances back, and so-and-so aired a grievance, and you want to prove that you have a bigger grievance, so you air, it spirals out of control, which, by the way, is also what we've heard exactly out of people reporting what they experienced in these various sensitivity trainings and DEI trainings. By the way, speaking of my Only Subs, another thing coming out there soon as of this recording, it might be out by the time this comes out, we'll see, is I actually read a CIA document from 1974 discussing sensitivity training. And they say, sensitivity training specifically for the agency itself, and they say that it's strongly not recommended to do sensitivity training in the CIA because it causes groupthink, and it causes people to, it causes more problems than it solves. In fact, it's actually really bad, but the people who go through it for some reason think that it was really good. And so the CIA in the 70s recommended strongly against that. We now know that's not the case. But at any rate, once the speaking bitterness occurs, once it starts, whether it's against each other, the nationalists, old China, old leaders, whatever, whoever, once they started to do it, it was like a dam broke. And when the dam breaks, everybody, it's almost competitive of how much grievance you can air. And then, of course, you've got retaliatory grievance airing. You could imagine John stole my, shovel or whatever and broke it, or I loaned him my shovel and he broke it and he never paid me back, or something like that. And so then John comes along and says, well, you should hear the stuff Bill did to my, whatever it happens to be. I'm not going to get into any made up details, but you can imagine how there's this reciprocating grievance airing, negativity breeding negativity. And what I expose in the book club episode about speaking bitterness is that, which I encourage you to listen to it or go get the book, The Tragedy of Liberation, yourself and read it, is just how awful the results of this were. I mean, I just read directly from Decatur, who makes it extraordinarily clear that this culminated in basically everybody trashing everybody, a torn apart community, and eventually to the point of lynchings, not just handing people over to the communists, but lynchings. So encouraged by the communists to participate in all this, virtually everybody would start airing all their grievances against each other. If they weren't doing so proactively and voluntarily, like some would, it would eventually, like I said, be done in retribution for the grievances that had already been aired against them and the shame and humiliation that followed. If you read Robert J. Lifton on how the Maoist cult of thought reform or ideological remolding or brainwashing worked, it was all driven by guilt and shame. You would have this shame heaped upon you for being a certain way, which you would then realize applied to you, and then you would try to hide that in yourself as much as possible and blame other people for it by projecting it off of you. And this caused what he called cult of confession that actually became competitive, not just to rat other people out, but to confess and to therefore remold your own thoughts and adopt communism. And so this went to the point where that would spiral out of control. Everyone was trashing everyone. And it got so bad, as I read in the Only Subs episode about speaking bitterness campaigns directly from Decatur, it got so bad that the communists frequently couldn't even keep control over the populations that were subjected to their speak bitterness campaigns, which, let me just emphasize, that ended up being everybody. They did this to everybody. Everybody in China was subjected to speak bitterness campaigns because of their power to destroy the fabric of a community, or in the DEI landscape, the fabric of a corporate culture or company culture or institutional culture. And you can destroy that fabric, and then you can ideologically remold. And like I said, that whole class hierarchy, the data mining they did in the beginning to find out how privileged people were, that data mining allowed them to direct the campaign, the bitterness campaign, in a particular direction against particular people, which created this whole competitiveness to stay out of those categories and to throw other people into them, because in many cases, in fact, there were quotas put down from the central government on how many people had to have their stuff confiscated, go to jail, go to the gulag, go to labor camps, be killed, whatever it happened to be. And like I said, the murder, the hate that this generated was so shocking. When I read this the first time in the Tragedy of Liberation, I put this on Twitter, that the hate that communism inspired marching across China is so overwhelming that it feels, when you read about it, like it has to be supernatural. Supernatural evil is almost the only explanation, but of course there's human psychology and the deep weaknesses and crevasses in it. But these populations would spiral out of control. Mass hatred, mass enmity, one against another, nobody getting along, nobody trusting each other, and ratting people out constantly, and often violence, if not murder, would follow. And to the point where there were villagers who would be murdering people, and the communists would be like, you have to murder fewer people. And they're like, if you don't let us, we'll take away all your food and we'll murder you. And so like even, the desire to hate and murder that followed from the Speak Bitterness hate craft was so incredible that they couldn't even reel it in a lot of cases. But what they could do, what the communists had orchestrated the whole program to do, was to direct that bitterness up that class hierarchy ladder in a consistent way. So the communists would make the poor peasants hate the middle peasants, and they would make the poor peasants and the middle peasants hate the rich peasants, and everybody was to hate the landlords who were hoarding land, even though the definitions for these things were completely bogus. A landlord might have barely a little bit more land and has somebody who's helping him work the land. A rich peasant might have a window pane in his mud hut. He doesn't even have like a real house. And he might have one window pane or two window panes, or he'll have two walks to cook in rather than one. That made you a rich peasant, not even a middle peasant, a rich peasant. And they would turn the hatred of this entire roiling and boiling community against the people further up the class, landlords, rich peasants, and even middle peasants as it went down. They color-coded people, like red, white, and gray. And like white was really bad, by the way, and gray was in between. And they would just absolutely trash these people, and people would compete to be identified as red, which was poor. And in fact, they were so invested in showing this that they actually adopted a mentality of poverty is good. Poverty is a symbol of your commitment. And this is the same as seeing what you see with these kind of strident anti-racists and allies and crusaders and accomplices and whatever other words they use coming out of DEI training. It's the same thing. It's the same program. So as long as the communists could force this hate to flow up this artificial status or class hierarchy, which didn't even apply to the majority of people it was applied to. I did an episode in the Only Subs book club about that too, specifically reading from Decatur how these class designations definitely did not apply. They would come to a village, for example, and there wasn't a single person who could possibly qualify as rich. There wasn't a single person who could even qualify as middle. So they would just kind of artificially decide whoever was barely best off, just a hair's breadth better off than their neighbors. Like, having an extra half a square meter in their hut. Now that person's the rich person. So they could have this artificial class hierarchy. And the people were bewildered about how they got placed where they were. And since it didn't make sense, since there were arbitrary rules and it was enforced by the communists, the people fought like hell not to be classified that way, which created more hate, more enmity, more bitterness, more fighting, more violence. And as long as the communists could direct this hatred up the hierarchy, up this artificial class hierarchy they'd built out, they were generally happy, even though it was getting out of control. Violence and murder broke out so badly, in fact, that even the cadres were extorted by the villagers to be able to continue doing hate and violence and murder and theft when the communist cadres tried to stop it. So the result of Speak Bitterness campaigns in China was the utter destruction of entire communities. Some that had worked peacefully together for centuries only to be torn apart in weeks or months by these nightly resentment campaigns, these grievance-mongering campaigns, the grievance studies campaigns of the communists, which were all done in the name of airing and settling all grievances, when in fact what it did was inflame to like the heat of the sun, a nuclear fire of destruction of grievances one to another. Now, obviously, the point of this wasn't just to tell you about the Speak Bitterness campaigns in China. It's to also talk about DEI. Before I do that, though, I put this on Twitter about a week ago or so, and it went kind of viral. And She Van Fleet, who is a survivor of the Cultural Revolution in China, she is an American patriot now who's speaking up more loudly than almost anyone. She's the author of a book called Mao's America, which I wrote the foreword to and recommend. She said, speaking bitterness, this is how she replied to me. Speaking bitterness was also used to indoctrinate the young. In the speaking bitterness session below, and there's this picture of exactly that with a bunch of children, a poor peasant tells the audience the suffering he had endured in old China. So they're speaking bitterness about old China, which means before the CCP takeover. And he's using his ragged clothes, his old ragged clothes, as a prop. And the sign behind him in Chinese big character poster says, "Never forget class bitterness. Never let go the blood-soaked hatred." So the goal, she says, is to teach the young to hate class enemies. And this is just an army of, it looks like almost all young girls looking on at this. And so speaking bitterness, she says, is here in America. The marginalized, and she put that in quotes, the quote, marginalized people are consistently encouraged to speak their never-ending bitterness and grievances. It happened at my former workplace. After Floyd's death, in an all-hands meeting, 2 black employees were made to speak of the bitterness of racism that they had endured. The goal is the same, to foment hatred. So this is this was She Van Fleet's reply to me putting the concept on Twitter, and she lived through this, so she definitely knows what she's talking about. But what I want to draw the parallel not just to what she said, which was the all-hands DEI sensitivity meeting after George Floyd died. I want to draw the parallel directly to the DEI training, unconscious bias training, and so on. That's all a data mining project to get you to find out that you have this class hierarchy in terms of your racism and homophobia and transphobia and whatever else, classism maybe even, and then to encourage then that as fodder to direct Speak Bitterness campaigning in the guise of an HR department program that's supposed to improve workplace compliance. What it actually is, as we can see, is an openly communist cadre. That's your trainer, is a communist cadre forcing participation in a Speak Bitterness campaign that will tear your workplace apart, that will tear your institution apart, that will tear your community apart. So it's very difficult to comprehend the core purpose of DEI training and its policies outside of Speak Bitterness campaigning once you know about the Speak Bitterness campaign and how programmatic and important and central it was to the takeover of the Maoist communists of the CCP in China in the 1950s. I'm sure, I've talked endlessly in the past about other purposes of DEI, but this one's big. So when I gave the episode recently where I said that diversity means to politicize, inclusion means to force political accommodation, and equity means in the name of socialism, this is actually what I'm talking about. This is the Speak Bitterness is the tool by which they can shatter the cohesiveness of an institution or a community or a workplace so that they can redirect it into this class hierarchical bitterness campaign that's only destructive. And so it's extremely frustrating to realize this, because if we had learned about the history of China the way that we should have, if we would have known about Speak Bitterness campaigns, we would have recognized DEI training as a Speak Bitterness campaign from the beginning. And if we had recognized it as what it was from the beginning, instead of debating about how we might come up with ways to get around the requirement, put a check mark in the box, we would have actually said, no, we're not doing this. And we wouldn't have suffered nearly the damage to our society and our businesses and everything else that we hold dear because of this communist provocation if we had known what we were looking at. And that's fairly frustrating.